Hi everyone, I'm Rob Solomon. I specialize in building the tools, infrastructure, processes to enable and construct decentralized organizations with a specific focus in using market principles inside of firms. This journey started for me. Can you hear it? Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. This journey started for me 6 years ago, and I was leading a finance team at a company that implemented Holacracy, which is a very interesting and well-known framework for decentralizing organizations that I think is a bit problematic and incomplete. But getting exposure to that, there was a lot of promise there, and something that I still think is worth pursuing. So again, I work at a company called ConsenSys. What we are is a collection of 50 internal startups building wallet applications, supply chain applications, enterprise tools, developer tools. Panvala is part of ConsenSys. We also have our global enterprise solutions office. We have offices in New York, San Francisco, London, Ireland, Philippines, Australia, and so on. And then we have a bunch of teams that provide marketing, design, finance, legal, et cetera, to those teams. So that's kind of the network of what we are. And we're a remote-first company with people all over the place. So the reason for talking about this is because a lot of you probably already know a bit about ConsenSys, but the point I want to make is that we're trying to attack like every industry. We're trying to be we're already a very large company, and we want to scale to be even larger. We want to do that without losing our startupiness, because we're competing in a space that's moving rapidly and in a very decentralized, very emergent new space. And if we're operating like a big monolithic corporation off the bat, we're never going to succeed. So we have a theory as to why companies lose their startupiness, and that comes down to the ineffectiveness of centralized hierarchical coordination as organizations become more complex. So you can think about it when you're a small group, managing things in a centralized way is pretty easy, but as organization grows more complex, it gets increasingly difficult because communication lines in a hierarchy are low bandwidth, low fidelity. As information passes between people and departments, a lot of context and information is lost. Brain power is quite limited in its ability to absorb all the information that needs to be processed. And also, as an organization grows larger, the gap between what's best for the individual and what's best for organization starts to grow a bit. It starts to favor politicking, not taking any risks, not sticking your neck out, versus creating value for the organization. And so now we want to introduce decentralized market-based coordination as an alternative. And I want to talk about it in the context of an example. We use an economic system, because after all, an economic system is really just a very, very large corporation with a ton of divisions and a ton of decentralization that produces everything. So small village, imagine you have a 20-person village. It's very easy for a chief to say, okay, like you 10 go get food, you 5 build shelter, you 5 get clothes. I'll make sure everybody gets their fair share. Not only is that faster, more decisive, but it's probably actually leads to better outcomes, because if you were to kind of allow markets into that system, create a free-floating currency, court systems, contracts, that all comes with a cost. And let's say your one farmer decides he wants to become an artist. You can't necessarily wait for the market to correct and fill the demand for food. So in many ways, a small village is actually better run as a centrally planned organization. But obviously, as we all hopefully agree, the 100 million person economy needs currency, needs contract laws, needs court systems. It doesn't matter how smart that chief is; they could never run a 100 million person economy, or how many people they can delegate to. And so clearly, there's some point at which complexity allows for decentralized market-based coordination to become more effective than centralized hierarchical coordination. Same goes for companies. 20-person startup, it's pretty easy for a founder to know what's going on, to delegate and to organize things loosely and kind of manage it the more traditional way. But the issue comes as firms start to grow and pass this inflection point on the graph, yet still operate as a centralized organization. And if you think about it, why else would an organization with years and years of head start on R&D, distribution, human capital, resources, talent, routinely be outcompeted by small startups? And my theory is that it's because of the inefficiencies of operating with this structure past this point on the graph. So we want to get to a point where we're decentralized. We don't just mean delegating some limited authority. We're talking about truly distributing the way we make decisions as to what we do, how we do it, how resources are allocated, how we incentivize people. And so the things that we're doing are ranging from very subtle and common to more radical and new. So we'll start with the subtle and common. The first is transparency. We try to default to transparency. We have monthly town halls where our founder will answer very direct questions that he receives, and he's usually very truthful and open about it. We have a lot of conversations in Slack that most organizations, or some organizations, wouldn't want to have that publicly. Our process for budgeting, teams pitch the organization. The entire organization is welcome to come and give feedback on it. They're pitching their budget, they're pitching their plans, they're pitching their what their purpose is and how they make decisions, and all that's transparent. Next is purpose-driven teams. So that's organizing teams based on their purpose versus like their expertise and their geography. So what do I mean by that? Because I only have a little bit of time, I'm going to run through this part very quickly. But this is just example of a widgets company that produces widgets in China, warehouses them in Indianapolis, and then ships them retail and wholesale. Here's an example of the assistant general counsel. Usually I would go through more through this tool and talk about her position, but just no, she's an associate general counsel, assistant general counsel. Normally that would be where it would end on an org chart. But here, if you look at her roles, you can see that she has a role in the risk circle. She's the lease and landlord point person in the Indy warehouse team. She's a mentor, and she negotiates contracts for the materials procurement team. We're making explicit all of the different teams that she's a part of and her roles on those teams. So if you look at the team materials procurement, it's a really good example of a team that exists for a purpose. It's to procure materials. You have their kind of typical, the head and the people doing the search that are full-time on this, but you also can see there's a data analyst who's sitting in this team supporting them with data research. You have a contracts negotiator from the legal team. You even have their COO in here with a 5% role ensuring quality standards. So even though these people may sit elsewhere in traditional org structures, we're creating a team based on purpose where we're bringing people in and filling explicit roles so there's no confusion as to what's going on in the organization. Next is an agreements, the idea of an agreements fabric. And so I'll go through and talk about it from the lens of, just say, a data analytics team that's inside the organization. First is a team operating agreement. We want all of our teams to decide for themselves how they operate. So this is defining how they make decisions, how they onboard and offboard people, what their values are, and things like that. Typically, for any organization, okay, oh, really? All right. I have 2 minutes. So for any non-traditional team structure, people will tend to think they're aligned, realize they're not actually aligned. And then when there's issues, then they have to process that in real time. It's much more difficult. Mandate agreements are, let's say, between finance and this team. It defines their budget, their constraints. We try to keep things very loose, like in terms of burn and revenue targets, so that the team can stay dynamic and pivot as needed. Service agreements are agreements between teams. So if data analytics is providing data to other data analytics services to other teams in the organization, they define that with an agreement. If data analytics is receiving services from our facilities team, marketing team, et cetera, they would define those with a service agreement. And then for traditional external agreements, nothing new here. This is just, they might have external agreements between external customers, external vendors, nothing new. I'm going to skip over this one and then talk about this. So we like to go from something that looks more like this, a traditional org structure with different divisions, to something that looks more like this, more permeable system where our products become their own kind of self-governing autonomous micro companies, and you could think of the organization more like a city. Certainly there will be some, I'll just talk loudly. So certainly there will be some redundancy, waste, and missed opportunity for collaboration with this, but by letting go of the reins, our theory is that we can achieve better incentives, feedback loops, and scalability, so that we can grow into something much bigger, much more resilient. And really, so last slide, we're aiming to eventually enable companies to resemble cities. And so what do I mean by resembling cities? Like, well, it means something to be part of a city. If you're a company that's part of a city, there's taxes, there's laws, there's synergies that you get from co-location. Is it working now? Okay. And the city benefits when the companies that are kind of a part of it grow and prosper, but the city doesn't actively direct and manage those companies. They rely on market dynamics. The companies can interact with other companies outside and inside of the city. Similarly, companies in the future will become a collection of autonomous teams that behave like companies. They'll transact with one another, they'll transact outside the firm, and they'll receive their budget through various sources that may look like bootstrapping, taking out a loan, or fundraising. And these companies will become more like digital cities or digital economies. They'll be able to grow arbitrarily large because they're not constrained by the scaling limits of centralized coordination. They'll be able to attack an arbitrary number of industries, build an arbitrary number of products, live arbitrarily long, as they're going to be more resilient as they have certain teams kind of rising, falling, emerging, but the overall, nothing moving too radically. And so we're going to build out applications to enable teams to manage themselves and interact with one another kind of in this way. And we're going to probably create a handful of tokens used for governance, used for medium of exchange between teams, used for equity, used for utility and discounts within the organization. If you're an engineer and building something like this is interesting to you, come find me and we'll talk about it. But I guess save the last probably couple of minutes for questions. And yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Does it work? Yeah. So, have you gone into any resistance from people like, I don't want to learn this system, and how have you done the onboarding, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different parts that I talked. So there's like transparency, and there's some people who hate the transparency, some people who love it, some people who think we're wasting our time, that we're exposing too much information. So with that you have a challenge with transparency. With the biggest one that I've been most focused on is kind of the market dynamics and agreements infrastructure, and we have a lot of people, rightfully so, saying this creates a lot of friction. The idea that the trade-off is the explicitness, the scalability aspect, and so they do have a legitimate concern there. A lot of the challenge that I have is in framing. So if you frame it as this is capitalism inside a firm, there's a lot of people who don't like capitalism. They think it's ruthless and mean and inefficient. And so why would we want it inside of a firm? If you reframe it as, okay, somebody needs to give you your budget for your team. It could either be a centralized finance office who doesn't really know what you're doing, and they give you a budget because it sounds normal, and they could just pull it away from you. Or you could get your budget from your customers. We're going to decentralize the role of budget allocation. That same thing, but sounds a lot better to people. So a lot of it is in framing. A lot of it is in understanding the trade-offs, and people do have concerns that are valid, and with anything there's trade-offs. So, and my theory really is too that this is more appropriate for larger firms. Again, like I think a smaller, less complex firm has less to gain from some of these things. We'll pass it on.
So, classic like theory of the firm. The reason firms exist is to avoid having to make contracts for every individual action between people within the firm. So I guess, how do you reconcile those ideas?
Yeah, definitely read that one. So you're right. There are. It's my vision too isn't that each one person inside of an organization would be contracting everything within the organization. So it's more like teams of 20, 100, 200 people inside of an organization would act like they are a cohesive unit, and they would transact with other teams. So I guess my point is that I think a lot of companies have kind of passed the natural point of what should constitute a firm, and they have some inefficiencies because of it. And if we can find a way to still capture the benefits inside of a network, and if we can find a way to lower transaction costs inside the network, so a contract could be 1 page instead of being 40 pages, and you could settle things in a day with some type of internal arbitrator, versus going through the US court system or something like that, you can reduce the transaction costs enough that it's still beneficial to have smaller autonomous teams that they themselves operate like firms. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that more. I know we don't have much time. Is that everything?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.